Evelyn Hartwell pressed both hands flat against the wagon seat, braced herself, and stepped down into the dirt of Whitmore Ranch, and the laughter started before her second foot touched the ground. She heard every word, every whisper, every low, ugly chuckle passed between men who had already decided what she was worth before she opened her mouth. She did not cry. She did not turn back. She picked up her suitcase and walked straight into the most broken kitchen in Montana Territory. And she got to work. If this story already has your heart beating faster, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell and follow every single part of Evelyn's journey to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The wagon rolled to a stop, and the driver called out her name, like he was reading from a list, flat and businesslike, the way a man announces livestock at auction, rather than a woman arriving at the place she was meant to call home. Evelyn Hartwell stood, gathered the single suitcase that held every earthly thing she owned, and climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. She had stopped waiting for help a long time ago. The step was higher than she expected, and she landed heavier than was graceful, her wide hips and full figure absorbing the drop with a small grunt she refused to be ashamed of. Because she had learned long ago that her body carried her through harder things than stepping off wagons. She straightened up. She adjusted the collar of her dress, plain cotton, faded from too many washings, respectable the way poverty tries to be respectable. And that was when the laughter started. It wasn't loud at first. It was the quiet kind, the kind men think women can't hear, pass sideways between mouths while eyes stay fixed elsewhere. Two ranch hands leaning against the fence post nearest the gate. A third one sitting on an upturned crate near the barn, hat tipped low, arms crossed, watching her the way you watch something you've already dismissed. The one closest to the gate, young, freckle-faced, with the careless cruelty of a man who had never once been told his opinion didn't matter, spoke just loud enough for her to hear every syllable. "Lord Almighty," he said under his breath, nudging the man beside him. Caleb must have been truly desperate. The second man pressed his lips together. He had the decency to look away, but he did not say a word in her defense. Evelyn heard it. She heard all of it. She had been hearing versions of that sentence her entire life, spoken in different voices, in different towns, by different men and women who took one look at her and wrote the whole story before she said a single word. She knew what they saw. She had never once pretended otherwise. She saw a wide woman, a worn dress carrying a small bag. She understood precisely what that picture communicated to people who judged by pictures. What they could not see, what they were never going to see, not from that distance. Not with those eyes, was the 10 years she had spent cooking for a failing church community in western Kansas, stretching $5 of supplies into enough food to feed 40 families through the winter. They couldn't see the 6 months she had worked alongside a trail crew outside Abilene, the only woman in a camp of 30 men, learning to preserve meat without refrigeration and to make sourdough rise in conditions that would have defeated a professional baker. They couldn't see the grief she had packed down into the deepest part of herself when her mother died and left her with nothing but a recipe book and a set of cast iron pans she'd carried across 4 state lines. They couldn't see any of that, so they saw what they decided to see instead. Evelyn lifted her chin, picked up her suitcase, and walked toward the house. Caleb Whitmore was standing on the porch. She had expected someone cold. The letter he had sent through the matrimonial agency had been brief to the point of curtness. He needed a woman to manage his household, to cook for his workers, to bring some order to a property that had been running without one for too long. He had listed his requirements the way a man lists items needed from the general store. Practical, unsentimental. She had found that almost refreshing after years of people who said pretty things and delivered nothing. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad through the shoulders with hands that showed serious work scarred across the knuckles, seeing dark at the fingertips in the way leather and iron leave marks on men who use them daily. His face was angular and weathered, not handsome in a soft way but striking in the way of things that have survived genuine difficulty. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-40s. His hair, dark with threads of silver at the temples, was pushed back from his forehead under a hat he'd removed, which she found herself noticing because it was a small gesture of formality, and small gestures of formality mattered to her. He looked at her. She watched him process what he saw. She was practiced at reading that particular moment, the half-second recalibration men made when they had formed an image in their heads, and the reality before them didn't match it. She waited for what usually came next, the polite disappointment. The formal distance, the suddenly very careful voice. "Caleb Whitmore," said Miss Hartwell. "You made the trip all right?" Just that, matter of fact, not warm, not cold. The same voice he'd probably used to ask if the supply wagon had arrived on schedule. "I did," she said, "thank you." He nodded, looked at her suitcase, and said, "I'll have Thomas take that up." "I can manage it." He studied her for a moment. "All right." He stepped aside and held the door open. That was the whole of their first meeting. Evelyn walked inside. She did not see the look he gave the laughing ranch hand by the gate brief flat, and carrying in it the very clear message that it would not happen again. She did not see the young man's smirk disappear and his shoulders pull inward. She was already moving through the front room, following the smell, or rather, the absence of smell, toward the kitchen. What she found when she pushed open the kitchen door stopped her in her tracks. Not from discouragement. From pure, unfiltered professional assessment. She stood in the doorway and she looked, really looked, the way a doctor looks at a patient, cataloging, measuring, calculating what could be saved and what couldn't. The stove was a wreck. One of the cast iron burner plates was cracked clean through, which meant it would distribute heat unevenly, meaning anything requiring consistent temperature would come out ruined on one side. The firebox door hinge was bent. She pressed shut and felt how it didn't quite seal, which meant draft control was compromised, which explained the soot marks up the back wall. The shelves held almost nothing. A sack of flour that had been open too long and was starting to clump at the edges. A tin of salt nearly empty. 3 jars of preserves with lids that had started to rust. Cornmeal. A handful of dried beans that had been there so long they would take half a day to soak back to edible. 2 onions starting to soften, nothing else. The cutting block was scorched on one end and hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks. The 2 iron skillets hanging on the wall had been washed but not seasoned and were starting to show rust at the edges. The bread pans were warped. Evelyn set her suitcase down just inside the door. She crossed to the stove and crouched down in front of the firebox, examining the hinge with her fingers. She opened and closed it 3 times. Feeling exactly how the metal had shifted, working out whether it was a problem of the hinge pin or the bracket. "It's been like that for 6 weeks. She turned. Caleb was standing in the kitchen doorway watching her. "The cook who left," she said. "How long was she here before she quit?" 3 weeks. Before a man, he lasted 2 months. Before that, the women who ran this kitchen, until she passed, that was my wife, 5 years ago. Place hasn't been right since." He said it evenly, without self-pity, but the evenness itself told her something. There was nothing indifferent about the way a man describes the kitchen his wife ran. Even when the voice stays flat, the words choose themselves carefully. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said. "It was 5 years ago." Loss doesn't have a clock on it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The hinge needs replacing. I can get someone to look at it." "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight I'll work with what it is." "Can someone bring in extra wood? I'll need more than what's stacked." "What are you planning, supper?" He looked at the near-empty shelves. Something crossed his face, not skepticism exactly, more like the practiced caution of a man who had been disappointed enough times that he protected himself from expectation. "There's not much to work with. There's enough," she said. He didn't push back. He called for Thomas through the doorway, and Evelyn heard the sound of boots on the porch floor. And then she turned back to the stove and the ruined firebox and the warped bread pans and the 2 rust-edged skillets, and she rolled up her sleeves. Thomas Reed appeared in the kitchen doorway young, genuinely young, 17 or 18 at most, with an open, uncertain face that hadn't yet hardened into the closed-off expressions of the older hands. He was the one, she would later learn, who had pressed his lips together at the gate and looked away rather than join in the laughter. He wasn't brave enough to say anything, but he'd had the decency to feel the discomfort of it. She would remember that. "I need wood," she told him. "A full stack's worth beside the stove, and whatever you have in the root cellar, I need to know exactly what's down there, everything, even if it looks past its prime." He blinked at her. He clearly hadn't expected direct commands. "Yes, ma'am. What's Thomas?" "Thomas Reed." "Thomas, when you've done the wood, will you walk me to the root cellar yourself? I'd rather see it with my own eyes than get a list." Something in the boy's face shifted, a slight straightening, a small flicker of being taken seriously, that she recognized because she had been on the receiving end of it so rarely herself. "Yes, ma'am, I can do that." He went for the wood. Evelyn turned back to the stove, crouched again in front of the firebox, and began the careful process of bending the bracket back into position with her bare hands in the back of a wooden spoon handle, working it fraction by fraction until the draft seal improved. It wasn't a proper fix, but it would hold for tonight. She heard footsteps behind her, different boots, heavier, deliberate. The walk of a man who believed his footsteps communicated something about him. She didn't turn around. "You the new wife?" She recognized the voice. Not personally, but the type, older, certain of itself. The kind of voice that only spoke to you to establish where you ranked. "I'm Evelyn Hartwell," she said, still working the bracket. "And you are?" A pause. He hadn't expected to be the one asked to introduce himself. "Jack Dawson, senior hand on this property. Been here longer than the stove." "Then you'll know where the extra iron hooks are kept," she said. "The ones that should be above the fire but are missing." Another pause. "Storage shed," he said finally. "Second shelf on the right. I'd be grateful if you'd fetch them. I'll need them before I can hang anything properly." She heard him not move for a moment. She was still not looking at him. She was focused on the bracket, on the small correction she was making with her hands and a wooden spoon, and she let him stand there in his own silence until the silence became his problem, not hers. "You always order men around before you've been in a place an hour," he said. She stopped working. She turned and looked at him directly square, unhurried, without hostility or apology. He was what she'd expected from the voice. 60s, iron gray, the dense physical confidence of a man who'd spent 4 decades proving himself through labor. He had the look of someone who had decided what women were capable of before any particular woman had a chance to demonstrate otherwise. "I'm not ordering," she said calmly. "I'm asking. There's a difference, and I think you know it." She held his eyes. "If you don't want to bring the hooks, that's your right. But there's 15 men on this property who will be expecting supper in 4 hours, and I intend to give them a meal worth sitting down to. If the hooks will help with that, I'd appreciate them. If they won't, I'll manage without." She turned back to the stove. Behind her, Jack Dawson was quiet for a very long time. Then she heard his boots turn and cross the floor toward the back door. He went to the storage shed. He came back with the hooks. He set them on the table without a word and walked back out. Evelyn allowed herself exactly half a second of something quiet and private behind her eyes, not triumph, not vindication. Just the small, steady satisfaction of a woman who knows her own capabilities, and then she picked up the hooks and went back to work. Thomas came back with the wood, and then walked her down to the root cellar himself, holding the lantern while she moved through it, with deliberate, unhurried attention. She found what she expected: a cellar that had been stocked by someone who knew what they were doing, and then slowly depleted by people who did not know how to maintain it. There were still things here worth using. Wild onions someone had hung to dry. 3 large potatoes that had started to sprout at the eyes, but were still firm underneath. A crock of lard 2/3 full, a string of dried red peppers. 2 jars of preserved tomatoes, sealed properly, still good. Dried corn, a bundle of dried sage. She carried everything up herself, not because Thomas wouldn't have helped, but because she needed to hold each thing in her hands to understand what she was working with. Back in the kitchen, she began. This was the part that other people never quite understood about Evelyn Hartwell. The part that didn't translate well into any kind of language, that you couldn't explain to someone who hadn't experienced it themselves. When she was in a kitchen, even a broken kitchen, even one with a cracked burner plate and a bent firebox hinge and nearly empty shelves, something in her settled into a different register entirely. The anxiety that lived in other parts of her life, the anxiety of being looked at, of being measured and found wanting, of walking into a room full of people who had already formed their conclusions, went quiet. Not because the kitchen made her forget those things. Because in the kitchen, none of those things touched the work. The work existed on its own terms. You gave it what it needed, and it gave you back exactly what you put in, nothing less. She diced the potatoes with the precision of someone who had done it 10,000 times, uniform cubes that would cook evenly. She sliced the wild onions thin, letting their sharp smell fill the room. She worked the lard into the iron skillet with a piece of cloth, reseasoning the surface while the stove worked up to heat, and she stayed beside it for the first 20 minutes, monitoring the temperature with her hand held flat above the burner, adjusting the wood feed until the heat distributed as evenly as the cracked plate would allow. Thomas had drifted into the doorway and stayed there, watching. "You can come in," she said, not looking up. "I don't bite." He came in and sat on the stool in the corner, arms on his knees. He watched her work in silence for a little while. Then he said, "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" "Like what? I haven't made anything yet." "The way you're moving," he said. "Like you already know how it's going to come out." She smiled at the skillet, "My mother. And then 10 years of needing to feed people with less than I had." "Where was that?" "Kansas, mostly. A church community outside of Dodge City. We'd get maybe $2 a week for groceries for 40 people, some weeks less." "You learned to make things work." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "The boys are going to be surprised," he said carefully. "At supper. They're not," he stopped. "They're not expecting much," she said. "No, ma'am. That's all right," she said. "I've spent most of my life exceeding low expectations. I'm fairly practiced at it by now." He looked at her, and she could see him working through something, the gap between what he'd heard the others saying and what he was seeing in front of him right now, and the fact that those two things didn't fit together cleanly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly enough that she almost missed it. "For earlier, at the gate, I should have said something." She looked at him then. Directly, he was watching his own boots, jaw working like he was bracing for something. "You didn't laugh," she said. "I didn't stop it either." "No," she agreed. "But you didn't laugh." She went back to the skillet. "That's not nothing, Thomas. Don't forget that." He didn't say anything else for a while. But he stayed in the kitchen, and somewhere around the second hour, without being asked, he started handing her things before she had to reach for them: the sage, the pepper, the second jar of tomatoes when the first ran low, and she noticed that too, and filed it away beside the fact that he hadn't laughed. The ranch hands came in for supper, with the particular energy of men who had already formed their conclusions, and were braced to be proven right. She could feel it in the way they entered too loud, covering something with noise, the way people do when they want to be seen as unbothered. The freckle-faced young one, she had learned his name, was Pete, came in first and had already begun to say something to the man beside him when the smell hit the table. He stopped talking. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when the body takes over from the brain. On the table, a deep skillet of sliced potatoes and wild onions roasted in lard until the edges went golden and crisp, seasoned with sage and the dried red peppers. A pot of bean soup built with the preserved tomatoes and the dried corn and everything else she'd found worth saving. The kind of soup that shouldn't have been as good as it was given what went into it, but was. Because she understood how long to cook each thing and in what order. Cornbread made in the warped pan, which had come out slightly irregular along one edge and absolutely perfect everywhere else. and on the end of the table, a small crock of the wild onion compound she'd made with the last of the lard and the sage, to spread on the bread. Nothing elaborate. Nothing that required ingredients she didn't have. Just food made with complete focused attention, by someone who understood that the difference between a meal that fills a stomach and a meal that actually nourishes a person is entirely in the hands that make it. The men sat down. Pete picked up a piece of cornbread with the automatic carelessness of someone who didn't expect to care about it. He took a bite. He put the piece down. He picked it up again and took another bite, more slowly this time. Across the table, one of the older hands, a man named Walt, who had barely looked at her when she walked in, had his eyes closed while he ate the soup, not in an exaggerated way, just in the way of a man momentarily gone somewhere else. Somewhere that smelled like this, a long time ago. Jack Dawson sat at the far end. He ate in silence, cutting his portion with the deliberate attention of a man trying very hard not to communicate anything. He ate every bite. He did not ask for more. He also did not speak a single dismissive word, and she understood that from Jack Dawson, that silence was its own kind of statement. Caleb Whitmore sat at the head of the table, as he always did, and ate without speaking, which was apparently standard. But partway through the meal, without preamble, without making a production of it, he looked up from his plate and said, "Miss Hartwell." She was standing near the stove, monitoring the heat, and she looked at him. "This is good," he said. It was by any measure a plain sentence. 2 words of genuine assessment from a man who did not traffic in flattery. She felt it settle somewhere in her chest like a coal catching. "Thank you," she said. He went back to his plate. After the meal, as the men were filing out, Pete, the freckle-faced one, the one who had spoken at the gate, stopped near the kitchen door. He stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, not meeting her eyes, the arrogance completely gone from him, replaced by something young and uncertain. "That was," he started, stopped. "Start again. That was real good, ma'am." She looked at him. "Thank you, Pete," she said, and she meant it without irony, without any shadow of the satisfaction she might have been entitled to feel. Because she understood that this boy would remember tonight for reasons he couldn't fully articulate yet, and that mattered more than winning something. He nodded, jammed his hat back on, and was gone. Thomas was the last one out of the kitchen, and he paused to pick up his own plate and the 2 nearest to him and bring them to the wash basin without being asked, stacking them carefully. She watched him. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." After they were all gone, Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen in the quiet and the warmth of the stove she had coaxed back into usefulness. She ran her hand along the surface of the cutting block, feeling the scorch mark and the worn grooves, all the history of hands that had worked here before her. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Kansas, small and crowded, and always smelling of something good. She thought about the 6 months on the trail crew and the way those 30 men had started, on the 3rd week, to bring her small things, a handful of wild herbs found along the route, a better piece of firewood, an extra jar of preserved fruit from someone's pack, small offerings, made without words, which were their own kind of language. She thought about the matrimonial agency letter, the one she had read 3 times before responding, the careful, business-like phrasing that said nothing about warmth and nothing about loneliness, but communicated both in the spaces between what it said. She straightened up. She banked the stove for the night the way she had been taught, carefully, methodically, preserving the heat without waste. She was not naive. She knew what she had come here for and what the terms of the arrangement were. She knew that one supper, however well received, did not change the fact that she was an unmarried woman of 38, with no family and no money and no particular claim to anything in this world except her own 2 hands and what she could do with them. She knew that the freckle-faced boy's apology was not the same as being welcomed, and that Jack Dawson's silence was not the same as respect, not yet. But she also knew what she had felt in that room tonight. She had felt the shift, that specific, unmistakable moment when a room full of people who have decided something about you encounters evidence that forces them to reconsider. She had felt it in the quiet that came over the table. She had felt it in Walt's closed eyes and Pete's stopped hand and Caleb Whitmore's plain, honest, undecorated 2 words. She had been here less than a day. She turned off the kitchen lamp. She picked up her suitcase from just inside the door where she had left it 8 hours ago, because she had not yet been shown to her room, and she carried it up the stairs to find it for herself. She was not discouraged. She was not afraid. She was Evelyn Hartwell, and she had walked into worse than this, and she had built something worth having out of less than this, and she intended to do exactly that again. Whatever these people thought they knew about her, whatever they had decided in that first moment when she stepped off the wagon and they measured her with their eyes and found her wanting, they were going to spend the next months discovering. One meal at a time, one quiet, deliberate action at a time, exactly how wrong they were. She found the room at the end of the hall, small, plain, with a narrow window that looked out over the dark shape of the land. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. She did not cry. She had cried enough in her life to know that crying was something you did when you had run out of better options, and she had not run out yet, not by a long measure. She sat in the quiet and she thought about what she had seen in that kitchen and in that root cellar and in that dining room tonight, and she began, with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, to plan. The stove hinge needed a proper fix. She'd need to get a look at the supply situation, not just what was left but what the ordering pattern had been, what was being wasted, what was being missed entirely. She'd need to understand the rhythms of the property when the men left, when they returned, what kind of work they were doing and how that affected what they needed to eat. She'd need to understand Caleb Whitmore, not because she was sentimental about it. Because running a household for a man required knowing how his mind worked, what he valued, what he noticed, and what he was willing to bend on. That was a practical matter, nothing more. Though she had noticed, in the kitchen doorway that afternoon, when she'd said that Loss didn't have a clock on it, that something in his face had changed, something careful and guarded had shifted, just for a moment. Just enough to show what was underneath it before he covered it back over again. She had noticed, and she filed that away too, in the part of herself that paid attention to things that mattered, because in her experience, the things people tried hardest not to show you were usually the most important things to understand. She lay back on the narrow bed without undressing. She stared at the ceiling in the dark, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into night, the distant movement of animals, the creak of the house cooling, the wind across the roof, and she thought, "I can work with this." She thought, "I can make something here." She did not need them to like her. She did not need them to welcome her. She did not need anything from these people, not right now, except the chance to do what she knew how to do in the place she had been given to do it. The rest would follow. It always did, when the work was good enough. Evelyn Hartwell closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, she slept without dreaming of leaving. She was back in the kitchen before first light, not because anyone told her to be. Not because there was a rule about it, or an expectation written into whatever arrangement Caleb Whitmore believed he had made when he his name to the matrimonial agency papers. She was there because that was who she was, the kind of woman whose mind, while her body still slept, had already moved through the next morning's problem 3 or 4 times and arrived at the solution, and by the time her eyes opened, staying in bed any longer was simply not an option her nature would allow. She had the stove going before the sky had fully decided what color it wanted to be. The firebox hinge held the way she'd bent it, the night before, not perfectly, but well enough. She'd packed a small strip of cloth into the gap where the seal failed, and the draft control was better than it had been. Not fixed. Functional, there was a difference, and she was deeply familiar with the territory between those 2 words. She worked through the flour situation first. The clumping at the bag's edges meant moisture had gotten in, which meant the bag had not been properly stored, which meant whoever had last been responsible for the kitchen either hadn't known or hadn't cared. She worked through the clumped sections with her fingers, separating the good from the ruined. And what she had left was enough barely, but enough for biscuits if she was economical, and bread if she pushed the rest of the morning. She was pushing the rest of the morning. She was mixing the second biscuit batch when she heard the boots on the back step. They were Thomas's boots. She had already learned the sound of them, lighter and less deliberate than the older men's, with a slight hesitation on the second step that told her the board was loose, and he'd learned to account for it. She had made a mental note about that loose board 3 times already and forgotten to mention it to anyone. She added it to the morning's list. Thomas came in with his hat already in his hand, which meant he'd taken it off before reaching the door, which meant he'd been thinking about how to present himself even before he arrived. She found that quietly touching. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Pour yourself some coffee. It's on the back burner." He went for the coffee, without hesitation, that was already different from yesterday, when he'd stood in the doorway, uncertain whether he was invited in. One day, she noted that too. "How early do the men usually come in?" she asked. "Depends on the day. Storm season, they're out before light. Normal days, first bell's at 6. What time is it now?" He checked the watch he kept in his breast pocket, a small silver one, slightly dented, well used. 4:45. Good. She shaped the biscuit rounds and set them in the pan. "I need someone to ride to town today, Thomas. I need to see the supply ledger from the past 6 months before I put in a new order, and I don't have it. Do you know where Mr. Whitmore keeps it?" "His office, I'd reckon." "Front room, the desk." Thomas wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "You could just ask him." "I intend to. I'm asking you first because I want to know whether that's a room people go into freely or whether it's a room I should knock before approaching." Thomas thought about it. "You knock," he said. "Thank you." She slid the biscuit pan toward the oven. "That's exactly what I needed to know." He watched her for a moment over his mug. "You ask a lot of questions," he said. "Not critically observationally, the way a young person notes something they're still making sense of." "I ask the questions that get me useful information," she said. "There's a difference between asking a lot and asking well." He considered that. He said, and drank his coffee. The men came in at 6 to a table that was not a same table they had sat at yesterday, and they knew it before they were even fully through the door. Fresh biscuits, more of them than last night, properly risen, with that particular smell that biscuits have when the fat is right, and the oven temperature is right, and the hand that made them understood both things. A pot of grain with dried fruit worked through it, sweetened with the last of a small jar of molasses she'd found pushed to the back of the highest shelf. Thick coffee. And on a plate at the center of the table, the leftover potatoes from last night's supper, sliced thin and fried in the skillet until they were golden and crisp at the edges, with the remaining sage crumbled over them. Nothing wasted, everything used, every bit of it good. Pete came in third and stopped so abruptly that the man behind him walked into his back. "Move, Pete," the man behind said. Pete moved. He sat down, reached for a biscuit, then pulled his hand back, then reached again, and the man next to him, Walt, the one who had closed his eyes over the soup last night, said without looking up from his own plate, "Boy, take the biscuit before I take it for you." Pete took the biscuit. Walt almost smiled. Across the table, a man named Hector, Mexican-born, 20 years on the ranch, quiet in the particular way of men who speak 2 languages fluently and have learned that in certain rooms, one of them works better than the other, looked at Evelyn, where she stood near the stove, and said, in careful, precise English, "The coffee is better today than it was yesterday." "Thank you, Hector. Yesterday was already better than anything we've had in 6 months. She met his eyes and gave him a small, genuine nod, because that was the appropriate response to a statement that had clearly cost him some deliberateness to make. Jack Dawson came in last, as he had the night before. He went to his seat at the far end, without looking at her. He poured his own coffee from the pot she'd left within reach, because she had observed yesterday that he did not like to ask for things, and she had moved the pot accordingly. He poured his coffee. He looked at the pot as if noticing for the first time that it was within reach. He said nothing, But his jaw worked in a very small way that Evelyn had already begun to understand was as close to appreciation as Jack Dawson's face got. She gave him that. After breakfast, she knocked on the office door. Come. Caleb was at his desk, already working. A ledger was open in front of him, and beside it a cup of coffee had clearly poured himself before she'd had the kitchen running, which meant he'd been awake even before she had. She filed that away without comment. I see the supply ledger for the past 6 months, she said. What was ordered, what was delivered, what the costs ran. Before I put in a new order, I need to understand what the pattern has been. He looked up. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise, more like a recalibration, the slight adjustment of a man who had expected a different kind of conversation. Most housekeepers just give me a list, he said. I'm not most housekeepers. A beat. No, he said in a voice she couldn't entirely read. Evidently not. He reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and produced a second ledger, narrower than the first, and held it out to her. 6 months is in there. The last full year is behind it. Same drawer if you need the comparison. She took the ledger. I thank you. She turned to go. Miss Hartwell. She turned back. The biscuits this morning, he said, and then seemed to decide something. My wife used to make them like that. The same. He stopped. I haven't had biscuits like that since she passed. The office was very quiet. I'm glad they were good, she said carefully. Yes, he said. They were. He looked back down at his ledger. That's all. She left him alone. In the hall with the supply ledger under her arm, she stood still for one moment with her hand flat against the wall. Not because she was overwhelmed by what he'd said she wasn't, but because she understood the size of what a man like Caleb Whitmore had just offered her, even if he hadn't intended to offer anything at all. He had just told her, in the plainest language available to a man who did not speak about himself, that she had done something that reached past the surface of his careful, managed, survived upon daily life, and touched something much older and more important. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Then she carried the ledger to the kitchen and spread it open on the cutting block and got to work. What she found in the ledger made her set her jaw. It wasn't catastrophic. It was the kind of bad that comes from accumulated carelessness, the death of a household by 1,000 small inefficiencies, each one invisible on its own, devastating in aggregate. She traced the ordering patterns with her finger, moving through the months. Too much of certain dry goods, ordered irregularly big orders when someone remembered, nothing for weeks when they forgot, which led to spoilage on one end and running out on the other. The perishables were the worst. She could see the month when the last cook had quit, the orders stopped abruptly, and then 3 weeks later there was a so large panicked order for things that didn't make sense together. Things a man had bought in a general store without a plan, just grabbed what seemed like it might be food. She thought about Caleb Whitmore in a general store alone, trying to provision a household he didn't know how to run, and she felt something that was not quite sympathy and not quite tenderness, but lived in the territory between them. She closed the ledger. She pulled a clean sheet of paper from the stack near the back of the kitchen shelf. Someone had left half a ream there. She'd noticed it last night. And she sat down at the kitchen table and began to write a new supply list. Not just what they needed now. A rotating 3-month plan organized by category, with notes on substitutions when primary supplies ran short and priorities marked by what would most affect the workers' health and productivity. She had done this in Kansas, where every dollar was squeezed until it bled, and she had done it on the trail. And she understood that feeding people well was not a luxury, it was a management decision. And it had measurable effects on how hard men worked and how long they stayed. She was on her 3rd page when the back door opened and Jack Dawson walked in. He stopped when he saw her at the kitchen table, with papers spread around her. She did not look up immediately. She finished the line she was writing. Then she said, "The loose board on the back step needs fixing. Someone's going to catch their boot on it in the dark." A silence. "I know about the board," he said, "then it should be easy to fix." Another silence longer. She heard him cross to the stove and pour coffee, even though he'd had 2 cups at breakfast and it was barely past 7. The coffee was an excuse. She understood that. He wanted to be in the room for a reason he hadn't fully worked out yet. She let him have it. "What are you writing?" he asked finally. "Supply plan. 3 months out, rotating basis. I need to put in an order today if anything's going to arrive before the end of the week, and I'm not putting in an order until I know what we're ordering and why." She heard him set down his mug. She heard him take 2 steps toward the table, the heavy, deliberate step of approaching something he's not yet decided about. She did not move, did not look up, did not do anything that could be read as inviting or challenging, just continued writing in her clear, even hand. He stood behind her left shoulder and looked at the papers. "That's a lot of writing," he said. "It's a lot of ranch." A pause. "You know how to do all this? The ordering, the planning." "I've done it for larger operations than this one." She wrote another line. 40 families in a church community outside Dodge City. 6 months on a trail crew. And before that, 4 years managing the household accounts for a family in Wichita while the wife was ill. "I know how to run a supply system, Jack." She used his first name deliberately, not casually carefully, the way you use a key. He was quiet for a long moment. "Then the men are going to need extra grain next month. Stock drive starts the 3rd week, and they'll be out longer days. They eat more when they're riding hard." She looked up at him then. He was looking at the paper, not at her. His arms were crossed. His voice had the particular flat quality of a man who is giving information while maintaining the right to claim he wasn't helping. "Thank you," she said. "I'll account for it." She wrote it down. He stood there another moment. Then he said gruffly, as if the words were being extracted against mild resistance, "Hector's got a bad stomach. Can't take heavy fat. The last 2 cooks never paid attention to that. He's been eating around half his meals for months." Evelyn looked up at him fully now. Jack Dawson's jaw was set hard, and he was looking at the wall to the left of her head, and the expression on his weathered face was the expression of a man who will never, under any circumstances, admit that he has just done something kind. "I'll remember that," she said quietly. "Don't make a thing of it." "I won't." He picked up his mug, drank the coffee he hadn't needed, set it back down, and walked out. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table for a moment after he left. Then she added a line to the supply list, "Lighter fats for 1 noted." And she allowed herself privately one small smile. The supply order went out that afternoon, with Thomas riding it to town. She had written it clearly enough that he only needed to hand it over the counter, everything itemized, quantities specified, costs estimated against the ledger figures, so whoever filled the order would know the budget she was working within. She spent the afternoon in the kitchen, inventorying what she had properly, now that she could see it in daylight, organizing the shelves by type and frequency of use, fixing the warped bread pan with a technique she'd learned from an old German baker in Wichita who had explained, patiently and at some length, that a warped pan was not ruined. It was just expressing a preference. And you managed it by weighting it against the oven rack for the first 10 minutes. She was weighting the bread pan when she heard raised voices in the yard. Not fighting loud, dispute loud. The particular volume men use when they want to be heard, but don't want to be seen as starting something. She did not go to the window. She continued with what she was doing, but she listened. She could make out Pete's voice, and then another one she hadn't placed yet, harder-edged with an unfamiliar accent, not local. And then Caleb's voice, lower than the others, the kind of low that was worse than shouting. Then boots on the porch, and the front door, and then movement in the hall, and Akelib appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking the specific kind of tightly controlled that told her whatever had happened outside had mattered. "There's going to be extra men for supper," he said. 3 men arriving from the Holloway spread. They'll be staying the night. Evelyn looked at him steadily. "All right, what's the situation?" He paused. In his world, she understood, women didn't ask about situations. They accepted information and adjusted accordingly. "Holloway's foreman is claiming water rights on the North Creek," he said. He sent 3 men over to make the point in person. And is his claim legitimate? Another pause. Longer. She watched him decide whether to answer her, like she'd asked a useful question, or redirect her back to the kitchen. He answered her. No. We've had North Creek rights since my father's time. He's trying to crowd us into selling the North Quarter. Has he done this before? Tried twice, each time we held. Third time he's escalating. Who's the Holloway foreman? Man named Crane, Gerald Crane. He's been Holloway's dog for 6 years, and he's smart enough to know the law and mean enough not to care. Evelyn nodded slowly. She turned back to her bread pan and picked up the weights. Send the 3 men to the kitchen for supper with others, she said. Don't separate them. Let them sit at the same table. Caleb frowned. Why? Because men who eat together don't fight as readily as men who eat across a line from each other. And because I'd like to know what Gerald Crane's men talk about when they're comfortable and fed, and think they're among people who don't matter. She met his eyes. I'll remember everything I hear. Caleb Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. It was a different kind of looking than the first day, not assessment, not recalibration. Something quieter and more serious. All right, he said. Supper that night was larger and louder, and substantially more complicated than the night before. The 3 men from Holloway spread 2 young, 1 middle-aged. All 3 wearing the particular attitude of men sent to make an impression came into the dining room, with their chests slightly forward. Looking around the table with the evaluating eyes of people who expect to hold the room. They stopped doing that within about 4 minutes of sitting down. Evelyn had made a roast she'd found a joint in the cold storage she hadn't fully cataloged yet, older but still good, which she'd rubbed with mustard seed and the remaining dried herbs and slow-cooked all afternoon with the root vegetables Thomas had brought up from the cellar. With it, fresh bread from the pan she'd fixed, properly risen, the crust right. Beans cooked with the smoked bone she'd also found in cold storage and had been saving for exactly this kind of occasion. Everything generous, everything deliberate. The Holloway men ate. They ate a lot. Halfway through supper, the middle-aged one, the clear senior of the 3, a man named Burke, looked down the table to where Evelyn was refilling the bread plate and said, with a kind of helpless sincerity that clearly embarrassed him slightly, "Ma'am, I haven't eaten like this in years." Pete, from 3 seats down, said absolutely nothing, but gave Burke a look that communicated a very precise message. Now you know. Burke ate 2 more slices of bread. Around the table, Evelyn moved and listened and said very little. She heard the younger 2 from Holloway talking not about water rights, not directly, but about Crane, the foreman, and the way he talked about Whitmore's North Quarter. She heard the phrase, "Crane says the old man won't hold out past autumn." She heard the second young one respond with something that was swallowed by conversation, but she caught the word pressure and the word bank. She carried those words back to the kitchen with the empty bread plate, and she turned them over in her mind, tasting their shape, understanding what they implied. Bank pressure past autumn. Gerald Crane wasn't just claiming water rights. He was working on 2 tracks, and the water rights dispute was the one they could see, which meant the bank angle was the one they were supposed to miss. After supper, when the Holloway men had been shown to the bunkhouse and the regular hands had gone to their bunks, Evelyn dried the last of the dishes and then walked down the hall to the office and knocked. Come. Caleb was at his desk again, the same posture, the same lamp, but the ledger in front of him was different, not the household accounts, something else. Figures she could see from the doorway were written in the careful columns of financial records. She came in and stood in front of his desk. "I need to tell you something," she said. "About what I heard at supper." He looked up at her. "Sit down." She sat. She told him everything she'd heard, exact words where she had them, paraphrase where she didn't, her own analysis of what the bank reference might mean separate from the water rights dispute. Clearly marked as her interpretation, so he could weigh it accordingly. He listened without interrupting. His face, while she talked, was very still in the way of faces that are processing something serious. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Bank pressure, he said slowly. If Crane is working Holloway's connection at the bank, if there's a note against this property, or a renewal coming due, the water rights dispute is a distraction. It makes you spend time and energy on lawyers and boundary lines, while something more foundational is being worked from the other side. Caleb looked at her. How do you know about this kind of thing? He asked. The church community in Kansas, she said. A man named Durant tried exactly this on 20 farming families over 3 years. Water access disputes on the surface, banknotes worked underneath. By the time anyone understood the full picture, he'd bought 6 properties out of forced sale. What happened to Durant? The families organized. They went to the county seat together, all 20 of them, with their own lawyer and their own documentation. Durant hadn't expected them to understand what he was doing, let alone fight it in a coordinated way. She paused. He'd underestimated them. He thought because they were poor and separate, they were also ignorant. Caleb held her gaze. Something moved across his face, something that was not quite an emotion, but was the territory just before an emotion, the moment before a man decides to let something register. Do you have any documentation of the water rights? She asked. Original grants deeds, your father's papers. In this desk. Bottom right drawer. I think you should have someone look at them. Not just a local lawyer. Someone from the county seat who doesn't have a relationship with Holloway. She stood. I'm sorry if this isn't what you expected me to come in here and say. He looked up at her. What did you expect me to say back to you? I wasn't sure. I was prepared for you to tell me to stay in my kitchen. A pause. You should stay in your kitchen, he said. And something in his voice was different from anything she'd heard from him, yet not warmth exactly, but the direction of it, the way weather moves before it arrives. And I should read those papers tonight. She nodded. She was at the door when he said, Miss Hartwell. She turned. Thank you, he said. And he said it the way he had said. The biscuits were good without decoration, without performance, just the plain true weight of it. She walked back to her kitchen. She cleaned the last of the dishes in the quiet and the warm dark, and she thought about a man working through his father's papers by lamplight, looking for the shape of an attack he might not have seen coming. And she thought about the word bank and the word autumn and the specific practiced patience of men like Gerald Crane. And she thought about 20 farming families in Kansas who had surprised someone who believed he had already won. She banked the stove. She dried her hands on her apron. And somewhere in the house, a desk drawer opened, and paper turned, and a man who had spent 5 years managing a loan began, without quite knowing it yet, to understand that he no longer had to. The papers Caleb pulled from that bottom drawer kept him up past midnight. Evelyn knew this because she heard the lamp in the office still burning when she got up at 2 in the morning for a glass of water, and she saw the thin line of light under the office door. And she stood in the hall for just a moment, listening to the quiet sound of paper turning, methodical and slow, the sound of a man reading with his full attention. She went back to bed without knocking. He didn't need her at 2 in the morning. He needed the papers. She had given him what she could, and the rest was his to work through in his own time and his own way. And she understood that about men like Caleb Whitmore, you didn't push them toward conclusions. You put the information in their hands, and you let them arrive. She was back in the kitchen at 4:30. The supply order Thomas had ridden into town with came back partially filled, not because the store didn't have it. Thomas explained when he returned. Slightly out of breath and carrying the look of someone who had encountered something unexpected and hadn't yet decided how to report it, but because the store owner, a man named Aldridge, had said that the Whitmore account had a hold on it. Evelyn set down the bowl she was holding. A hold, she repeated. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Aldridge said he was real sorry about it, but there was a hold from the bank, the Territorial Bank on 2nd Street, and until it was cleared, he couldn't extend credit on the account. How long has the account been open? Long as I've been here, Thomas said. 8 years. Mr. Whitmore's father opened it. Has there ever been a hold before? Not that I know of. Evelyn untied her apron. Where is Mr. Whitmore? North pasture, I think, riding fence with Hector. Go get him, Thomas, now please. Don't tell him why on your way out, just bring him back. Thomas read her face, put his hat back on and went. She used the 20 minutes before they returned to finish the morning's bread and to think through what she knew in the sequence. She knew it. The Holloway men at supper. Burke's conversation with the younger hand, the word bank, the word pressure, the phrase past autumn. Crane working 2 tracks. The water rights dispute as the visible fight and something financial as the concealed one. And now a credit hold on an 8-year account, appearing the morning after Caleb had spent the night reading his father's papers. The timing was not coincidence. Gerald Crane had eyes somewhere. Either in town or on the road or closer than that. Caleb came through the back door, still dusty from the north pasture, Hector 2 steps behind him. He looked at her face and didn't bother with a preamble. "What happened?" she told him. Concisely, in order, without speculation beyond what she clearly marked as her own interpretation. He listened with his hat in his hand, and his jaw, set in the particular way she'd already come to understand, meant he was managing something he hadn't been prepared for. When she finished, he looked at Thomas. "Aldridge give you anything in writing?" "No, sir, just said what he said." Caleb put his hat back on. "I'm going into town. I'm coming with you," Evelyn said. He turned and looked at her. She had not phrased it as a request, and they both understood that. "This isn't a household matter," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's a financial matter, and I have been managing household accounts and supply finances for other people's operations for the better part of a decade. I also heard what was said at supper last night, which you did not. I may recognize something in the way Aldridge talks about this that you might not." A silence between them, but a different silence than the ones they'd had before. Not distance, negotiation. "All right," Caleb said. Hector, standing just inside the door, said nothing. But when Evelyn glanced at him on her way to get her coat, his expression was the expression of a man watching something he approves of quietly enough that he'd deny it if asked. The ride into town was the first time Evelyn had been in a wagon beside Caleb Whitmore, without another person or a pile of luggage between them. He drove the way he did most things, without wasted movement, without commentary, letting the road be the road. She sat on the bench beside him, with her hands folded in her lap, and watched the distance and thought about what she needed to pay attention to once they arrived. Aldridge ran a proper general store, organized and well-stocked, with the particular atmosphere of a business that wanted to be seen as reliable. He was a small man, 50s, with the anxious courtesy of someone who disliked conflict, but encountered it regularly in his line of work. When he saw Caleb come through the door, he came around the counter immediately, hands out, already apologizing. "Mr. Whitmore, I want you to know I had no choice in this. The notice from the bank came in yesterday afternoon, and I'm bound by the terms of the credit agreement to hold the account when." "Who brought the notice?" Aldridge blinked. "It came by messenger, from the bank. Messenger come from the bank itself, or from somewhere else and routed through." Aldridge's mouth opened, then closed. He clearly hadn't thought to look at that. Evelyn stepped forward. "Mr. Aldridge, I wonder if I might see the notice." "Just so we have a clear picture of what we're dealing with." Aldridge looked at Caleb, who gave a small nod, and Aldridge went to his back room and returned with a single sheet of paper. Evelyn took it. She read it quickly, then read it again more slowly, looking at specific things. The letterhead was Territorial Bank. The language was formal standard credit hold language, nothing unusual there. The signature was a bank officer named Prescott. The date was 2 days ago. 2 days ago. Before the Holloway men had come to supper, before she'd heard the conversation about the bank, before Caleb had spent the night reading his father's papers. This had been set in motion before the supper, before any of last night. This wasn't a reaction to Caleb reading the documents. This was already in motion, and the supper visit from Holloway's men had been something else entirely, not a threat, a distraction. Something to occupy Caleb's attention while the credit hold landed quietly at Aldridge's store. She handed the paper to Caleb without speaking, but she held his gaze for one moment, and she watched him read her face and understand that she'd found something. He read the paper, then he folded it and handed it back to Aldridge. "I'll be at the bank this afternoon," he said. "I'd like you to hold this notice until I've spoken with Prescott." Aldridge took the paper and looked visibly relieved to have someone making a decision. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Of course." Outside in the wagon, before Caleb picked up the reins, Evelyn said, "The hold was initiated 2 days ago." "I know. The Holloway men came last night. That wasn't about pressure. They came so you'd be focused on water rights, while the credit action was already in place." "I know," he said again, and there was something in his voice that was tight and careful and under it. Something she'd not heard from him before, the particular anger of a man who prides himself on seeing what's coming and has just understood that he missed it. "You didn't miss it because you weren't paying attention," she said, without preamble, without softening it beyond what it needed. "You missed it because you were fighting alone, and you only had one set of eyes." He looked at her. She looked back. "2 sets sees more," she said. "That's not a criticism, that's arithmetic." A long pause. The street moved around them, a woman crossing with a basket, 2 men talking outside the barber, a horse tied to a post flicking its tail. "I've been running this ranch alone for 5 years," he said. "I know. I've managed," she said. "I'm not disputing that. I'm saying you don't have to anymore." She picked up her hands from her lap and put them back down. "If you don't want to use what I can offer, I'll accept that and stay in my kitchen. But I think you already know that would be a waste." The silence between them was the longest yet, and different in quality from all the others. She let it breathe, she did not fill it. "The bank," he said finally. "Prescott, do you know anything about territorial bank holds and what triggers them legally?" "Some," she said. "Enough to know what questions to ask." He picked up the reins. "Then you're coming to the bank," he said. Prescott turned out to be a man of perhaps 50, prosperous in the way of men who have spent their careers navigating other people's money, with the careful, managed warmth of someone who had learned that being liked was a professional asset. He greeted Caleb with the particular combination of apology and authority that bankers deploy when they want you to feel heard while changing absolutely nothing. Evelyn sat in the chair beside Caleb's and folded her hands in her lap and said nothing for the first 6 minutes. She listened. She watched Prescott's hands. People's hands told you more than their faces. She watched how he referenced papers, which ones he held toward them, and which ones he kept angled away. She watched his eyes when Caleb asked about the basis for the hold, and she noted the very small, very deliberate way Prescott did not look at the door on his left before he answered. Office on the left. Someone in there, or something in there, that was relevant to this conversation. His instinct had been to look at it, and he'd suppressed the instinct. She marked it. After 6 minutes, she said, "Mr. Prescott, what's the specific clause under which the hold was initiated? The letter referenced a credit agreement irregularity, but I'd like to see which section of the original agreement is cited." Prescott looked at her. He had the practiced blankness of a man recalibrating who was in the room. "I'm sorry. And you are Evelyn Whitmore," she said, the name arriving in the air between them before she'd fully decided to say it. She felt Caleb beside her go very still. "I manage the household accounts for Whitmore Ranch. The supply credit is part of those accounts." She had not used that name before. She was not, technically, Evelyn Whitmore. The papers had been signed, but no ceremony had occurred. The arrangement was practical and had not yet become anything else. But Prescott didn't know that, and the name landed in the room with the weight of legitimacy, and she watched it change the temperature of the conversation in real time. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore," Prescott said, and reached for a different set of papers. Beside her, Caleb said absolutely nothing. What Prescott showed them, once Evelyn had asked for the specific clause twice more, and shown a detailed enough knowledge of credit agreement language to make clear she was going to keep asking until she got the actual document. was an irregularity notice based on a complaint filed by a third party claiming that the Whitmore property's north quarter boundary was in dispute, and therefore the property's assessed value as collateral was uncertain. The complaint had been filed by a lawyer named Sutter. Evelyn had never heard of Sutter, but she watched Caleb's hand on the arm of the chair tighten, just slightly, just one, and she understood that he had. Outside the bank, in the full force heat of the day, Caleb put his hat on and stood for a moment with his jaw working in that way she'd learned to read. Sutter, she said, Holloway's lawyer. Based in the county seat, but he does Holloway's local work. Can he file a complaint that triggers a bank hold on the basis of a disputed boundary claim? Apparently he just did. That answers whether he can. I'm asking whether the claim is legitimate enough to withstand scrutiny. Caleb turned and looked at her directly, and his eyes were the specific shade of gray she'd noticed on the first day, neither warm nor cold, but very present. No, he said. The boundary has been established since my father's time and the deed is clean. Then what Sutter filed is at minimum a misrepresentation to a financial institution. She held his gaze. That may be actionable. He studied her face for a moment. You sound very certain about that, for a woman who cooks for a living. She did not blink. I cooked for a lawyer in Wichita for 4 years while his wife was ill. I also managed his files, his correspondence, and his household accounts. I listened while he worked because he thought out loud, and I was usually the only other person in the room. She tilted her head slightly. Does that answer your question? Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before. It was quieter than a smile and more significant than one. Yes, he said. It does. They were back at the ranch by mid-afternoon, and by the time the supper bell rang, everything had changed shape. Not because anything had been resolved. Nothing had been resolved. Gerald Crane's scheme was still in motion. Sutter's complaint was still sitting in the bank files, and the credit hold was still in place. None of that had shifted. But Caleb had spent the wagon ride home talking to her the way she suspected he had not talked to anyone since his wife died, not about feelings, not about the interior life he kept carefully managed, but about the ranch's actual situation. In specific terms, with the assumption that she would follow and contribute, and was someone whose understanding of the situation mattered to what happened next. He told her about the note on the North Quarter parcel, not a crisis, but due for renewal in 4 months, and if Holloway could engineer enough uncertainty around the property value before then, the renewal terms could change significantly. He told her about the timing of the cattle drive and how a disrupted supply credit would affect the provisioning for it. He told her about the county seat and the circuit judge, and when the next term opened. She listened to all of it. She asked questions when she had them, specific ones, the kind that moved the information forward, rather than retreating over ground already covered. When they pulled back into the ranch yard, she had a clearer picture of the full situation than she suspected anyone outside Caleb himself had ever had. And she was already turning over in her mind the shape of what needed to happen and in what order. Thomas came out to take the horses, and he looked between them as they climbed down from the wagon with the quick, perceptive assessment of a young man who paid close attention. Everything all right, he asked. Getting there, Evelyn said, and went inside to start supper. That night, after the dishes were done and the kitchen banked and the ranch quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with the paper she'd been adding to since the morning, and she wrote for almost an hour. Not the supply plan, something else. A chronology of everything she'd learned in the past 2 days, organized the way she'd learned to organize legal documents during those 4 years in Wichita. Dates, names, actions, the relationship between those actions and their apparent intended outcomes. She was on the 3rd page when Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had changed out of his riding clothes and looked, without the dust and the hat, younger and more tired simultaneously, the way men look in the evening when they stop performing whatever version of themselves they maintain for daylight. He looked at the paper spread across her table. What is that? Documentation, she said. A record of everything we know in the order we know it. If this goes to a lawyer or a judge, having a clear chronology matters. He crossed the room and stood at the edge of the table, looking at the pages without picking them up. He read for a moment, scanning. "You write like a legal clerk," he said. "I worked alongside one for 4 years." He was quiet, reading. Then he said, "You wrote 'We know.'" She looked up. He was still looking at the papers. "I did," she said. A pause. "You've been here 4 days," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like a man reading a map and finding a landmark he hadn't expected. "I know," she said. "Does that bother you?" He looked at her then. The lamp between them threw the light in a way that made the lines of his face very clear, not softened, not romanticized. Just the real face of a man who had carried a lot of weight for a long time and was standing in his own kitchen at 9 o'clock at night, looking at a woman who had ridden into town with him and used his name at the bank without being asked and spent. An hour building a legal chronology because it needed to be done and nobody else was going to do it. "No," he said slowly, like a man working out the answer as he said it. "No, it doesn't bother me." She nodded and went back to her writing. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He did not pick up a paper. He did not read over her shoulder. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you think we should do?" "About Crane." "About the bank, about all of it." She set her pen down. She looked at him across the table, and she thought about the 20 farming families in Kansas, and the way Durant had assumed that being scattered and poor meant being ignorant, and the way he had been wrong about that in a way that cost him everything he'd built over 3 years in a single afternoon at the county seat courthouse. "We go to the county seat," she said. "We take the original deed, the original water rights grant, and everything I've written here. We find a lawyer who isn't inside Holloway's orbit, and we file our own action challenging Sutter's complaint as a fraudulent misrepresentation. We do it before Crane expects us to have understood what he's doing, because right now he thinks he has time. He thinks you're watching the fence line while he works the bank." Caleb held her gaze. "And the supply credit in the meantime?" he said. "I'll make 3 months of provisions last 5, she said. "It won't be comfortable. It won't be the kind of table I've been setting. But the men will be fed, and they'll be fed well enough, and nobody will fall short on anything they genuinely need. You can do that. I've done it with less." He was very still for a long moment. Then he said, "When I signed those papers with the matrimonial agency, I wrote down that I needed a woman to manage my household." "I remember. It was in the letter. I didn't write down what I actually needed," he said, and his voice was even and careful and completely serious. "'Cause I didn't know what it was. I hadn't let myself know." He looked at the papers between them. "I think I might know now." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn held his gaze, and she let the weight of that sentence be exactly what it was: not small, not casual, not a thing to deflect or minimize, and she said, calmly and honestly, "I think you might." He nodded once slowly, the way he did everything without performance, without embellishment. He stood up, pushed the chair in, and looked at the papers one more time. "County seat," he said. "I'll arrange for us to go day after tomorrow. That gives you time to sort the provisioning plan before we leave." 2 days is enough," she said. He picked up the lamp he'd brought with him, leaving her the one on the table. "Good night, Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She heard it land in the quiet kitchen like a stone dropped into very still water, the sound of it, and then the rings moving outward from where it had been. "Good night, Caleb," she said. He walked down the hall. She turned back to her papers, and she continued to write, and her hand was completely steady, and the lamp burned quietly beside her. And somewhere outside the window, the night was doing whatever nights did in Montana. And inside the kitchen, everything was different from what it had been the day before, and different again from what it had been this morning, and she understood with the clear, full, practical certainty of a woman who has navigated enough of the world to know how its pieces move, that it was going to keep getting different still. She wrote for another 30 minutes. Then she banked the stove, gathered her papers into a careful stack, and went upstairs to plan the next 4 moves. In the sequence they would need to happen, the way she planned everything completely, carefully, and without a single wasted step. They left for the county seat 2 days later, before the sun was fully up. Evelyn had the provisioning plan done by the morning of the first day. 3 months of supplies, stretched to 5, organized by priority and substitution, written out clearly enough that Jack Dawson could execute it without her, if he needed to. She had handed it to him the evening before they left, standing in the kitchen, and he had taken it without a word, read through the first 2 pages with the slow attention of a man who took written instructions seriously, and then looked up at her with that flat, carefully neutral expression she had come to understand was his version of respect. "The men won't notice the difference," she said. "Not if it's done right. And I've written it so it can be done right." "What about the bread?" Jack said. "They notice the bread. There's enough flour for 3 weeks at current volume. After that, halve the daily amount and supplement with the grain porridge recipe on the last page. They'll complain for 2 days and then stop." Jack looked at the last page. He read the recipe. He turned back to the first page. "You trust me with this," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I trust you with this," she said directly, without qualification. He stood with the papers in his hands for a moment, and something moved through his face that he managed quickly, the way a man manages something that catches him off guard. "All right," he said. He folded the papers into his breast pocket with the care of someone storing something valuable, and he walked out. And she heard him in the yard shortly after that, talking to Thomas in a voice that was lower and more specific than his usual register, and she knew he was already planning. The wagon road to the county seat took most of a day. Caleb drove and Evelyn sat beside him with the chronology she'd written, folded inside her coat and her hands in her lap. And they covered the first hour in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill silence to make it bearable. Then Caleb said, "Tell me about the lawyer. What we're looking for." "Someone who's handled property disputes before, not just inheritance or contract work. Someone who's appeared before the circuit court and knows the presiding judge's preferences. Someone who doesn't have a financial relationship with Holloway or anyone connected to Holloway." She paused. "And someone who won't make assumptions about who's doing the legal thinking." He glanced at her. "You mean someone who'll talk to both of us?" "I mean someone who'll talk to me," she said. "Some won't." He was quiet for a moment. "If they won't talk to you," he said carefully, "they aren't worth our time." She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road, but the line of his jaw was set in the specific way that meant he'd said exactly what he intended, and wasn't softening it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me, it's practical. You're the one who built the chronology. You're the one who understood the bank angle. Any lawyer who won't listen to you is a lawyer who's going to miss things, and I can't afford to have things missed right now." She turned and looked at the road ahead of them, and she kept her face neutral, and she let the feeling of that sentence, the simple, undecorated practical respect of it, settle somewhere in her chest, where she kept things that mattered. They found their lawyer on the second street they tried. His name was Daniel Foss, and he was younger than Evelyn expected, early 40s, lean, with the slightly distracted energy of a man who is always working 3 problems at once. His office was dense with papers, but they were organized, which she took as a good sign. He had appeared before the circuit court 11 times in the past year, according to the framed docket sheets on his wall, which she read while he shook Caleb's hand. When Caleb introduced her, Foss shook her hand too, without hesitation, and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, please sit down, both of you." She noted the both of you. She unfolded the chronology and set it on his desk without preamble, and said, "I've put together a documented account of the events as we know them, in sequence. I'd like you to read it before we talk, because it's more complete than anything we can give you verbally, and it will save us time." Foss looked at the papers, looked at her, and then pulled the chronology toward him and read it. She watched him read. He was a fast reader, not the skimming for highlights kind of fast, but the kind of fast that meant he was genuinely absorbing it. She could tell by the way his hand moved to them twice, the instinct to annotate. And the way he stopped at the same place she'd have stopped, if she were reading it for the first time, the section about the bank hold date, predating the supper visit, the timeline implication. This hold was initiated 2 days before they sent men to the ranch, he said. Yes, and you identified that at the bank itself, not after. Yes. He looked at Caleb. Is she always like this? Caleb said without a moment's hesitation, yes. Foss set the papers down. He leaned back. He said Sutter's filing is legally thin. The disputed boundary claim as grounds for a credit hold is going to be very difficult for him to defend if the deed and water rights documents are as clean as you're saying. Because a third-party complaint doesn't meet the standard for triggering a financial instrument hold without a higher evidentiary bar than Sutter appears to have met. He paused. What it tells me is that he was betting you wouldn't challenge it fast enough. He was betting you'd spend your energy on the water rights dispute and miss the financial angle until it had done its damage. He bet wrong, Evelyn said. Foss looked at her steadily. Yes, he said, he did. They were in Foss's office for 2 hours. By the time they left, the filing was drafted a formal challenge to Sutter's complaint on the material misrepresentation to a financial institution, combined with a request for emergency review of the credit hold based on the documented timeline, showing the complaint's basis was factually unsupported by any surveyed boundary finding. Foss would file it the next morning when the court opened. He estimated the emergency review would take 4 to 7 days. In the wagon on the way back, Caleb drove in silence for the first 20 minutes. Evelyn let him have it. Then he said 4 to 7 days. It could be faster, she said. Foss knows the clerk. He'll push for the short end. And if Crane moves on something else while we're waiting, then we document that too, she said. Every move he makes from here is another piece of evidence. He's in the position now of having to keep advancing a scheme that's being recorded. Caleb was quiet again for a moment. You knew all of this, he said. Before Foss confirmed any of it, you already knew. I suspected, she said. Knowing and suspecting are different. Close enough. He shifted the reins from one hand to the other. Where did you? He stopped. Started differently. The lawyer in Wichita. The one whose files you managed. Henry Alderton, she said. He did property law, mostly. Wills, deeds, land transactions. But he also handled 2 dispute cases in the 4 years I was there, and I watched him build both cases from the beginning. You learn the shape of how these things work when you're in the room while someone's working them. He was lucky to have you. He paid me $6 a month and let me sleep in the storage room off the kitchen. A silence. That's not what I meant, Caleb said quietly. I know, she said. I know what you meant. The road stretched out ahead of them, and the afternoon light was the particular quality of late-day light in Montana that has no equivalent anywhere else. She'd been clean and angled, and somehow both warm and clear at once. She did not comment on it. She sat with her hands in her lap and let the miles pass. After a while, Caleb said my wife's name was Clara. She did not respond immediately. She understood he hadn't said it as information. He'd said it because he was finally somewhere in himself where saying it felt possible. Tell me about her, Evelyn said. And he did. Not all at once, not in a flood. Whitmore was not a man given to floods of anything. But steadily, carefully, in the way he did things, he told her about Clara. How she had come to the ranch as a young woman, barely 20, and had not been afraid of a single thing about it, not the work or the isolation or the roughness of the first years when the ranch was barely holding. How she had run the kitchen like it was a headquarters, which in many ways it had been. How she had died fever, fast, 6 days from the first symptoms to the last breath, and how the ranch had gone on existing after that, in the mechanical way things exist when the heart has been removed from them. I didn't understand what she held together, he said. Not until it was gone, and I couldn't find a way to put it back. Evelyn listened. The cooks who came after, he said. I know I was impossible to work for. I didn't want them there. I didn't want anyone in that kitchen. I wasn't rational about it. You were grieving, she said. I was terrible. Both things can be true. He looked at her briefly, sideways, and then back at the road. You're very easy to talk to, he said, and he sounded slightly surprised by it, as if he had not intended to arrive at this observation, but could not honestly avoid it. I've been told that before, she said, usually by people who'd been keeping something in for too long. He made a low sound that was almost a laugh. She had not heard anything close to that from him before, and it settled something in her that she hadn't realized was waiting to be settled. They got back to the ranch after dark. Thomas met them in the yard and took the horses, and he looked between them, that quick, perceptive look he had, the one she'd come to rely on without fully knowing she'd come to rely on it, and then he said simply, Jack had supper kept warm. Both of you. Jack had, in fact, kept supper warm in the oven, and had additionally, apparently entirely on his own initiative, set 2 places at the small table in the kitchen rather than the big dining table. Which meant that the men had already eaten and cleared, and what remained was specifically for the 2 of them. She found this so unexpectedly thoughtful that she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at it before she could move. Caleb came in behind her and saw it too. He said nothing, but he hung his hat on the hook by the door and pulled out the chair and waited. She sat down, he sat across from her. They ate together in the kitchen, in the quiet of a house that had gone to sleep around them, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and simultaneously one of the most significant, and neither of them said anything about what it was. Because they were both people who understood that some things are more real when they are not spoken. The response from Foss came on the 4th day. Thomas brought the letter from town at mid-morning, and the look on his face when he handed it to Evelyn told her it was something. She took it to the kitchen and opened it and read it standing at the counter. Foss had filed the challenge. The circuit court clerk had accepted it for emergency review. But there was more, and this was what Thomas's face had been about. In the course of preparing the filing, Foss had discovered that Sutter had filed identical or near-identical complaints against 2 other ranches in the same county in the past 18 months. In both cases, the complaints had led to credit disruption, and in one case, the ranch had sold the disputed parcel within 3 months of the hold being placed. The second ranch had fought and lost, but here was what Foss had found. The lawyer who had represented that second ranch had not challenged the complaint's basis, he had only challenged the boundary claim itself, which was fighting on Sutter's chosen ground, which was what Sutter had counted on. Nobody in either case had challenged the mechanism. Nobody had argued that the complaint was a fraudulent misrepresentation to a financial institution. Nobody had come at it from the angle Evelyn had identified in Aldridge's store. Foss believed they had a substantially stronger case than either previous target, and more, he believed the pattern across 3 properties constituted evidence of a coordinated scheme, which elevated the matter from a property dispute to something with potential criminal implications for both, and, depending on what could be shown about his direction, Gerald Crane. Evelyn set the letter down on the counter. She stood very still for a moment, thinking through what this meant in sequence. Then she went to find Caleb. He was in the near barn, she thought, and he wasn't alone. Jack Dawson was with him, and 2 of the older ranch hands, and they were standing in a loose group with the particular posture of men who have been talking about something serious. They stopped when she appeared in the doorway. She looked at Caleb. I need to show you this letter now, if you can. He read her tone and excused himself from the group without ceremony, and she handed him the letter in the yard and stood while he read it. She watched his face. He was still for most of it. Then near the bottom, something shifted, his jaw tightened, and his eyes moved through a particular sequence she'd come to recognize. The sequence of a man who is absorbing something that makes him angry and is deciding where to put the anger so it becomes useful. 2 other ranches, he said, and at least 1 sale of a parcel under pressure. Henderson, he said, and something dark moved through his voice. The Henderson East Quarter. I heard they sold that parcel a year ago. Didn't know why. Now you do. He looked up from the letter. This is enough for a criminal filing. Foss thinks potentially, yes. It depends on what we can show about Crane's involvement in directing Sutter, whether they can demonstrate this was coordinated rather than independent actions by Sutter. Crane directed it, Caleb said. I'd stake everything I own on that. Staking what you own is exactly what we need to avoid, she said. We need to prove it. He handed the letter back to her. He looked at the ground for a moment, and she recognized what he was working through the scale of it, the fact that this was larger than he had understood. The particular anger of discovering that something you thought was targeted at you was actually part of a pattern that other people had been damaged by the same mechanism, and nobody had stopped it. I want to go back to the county seat, he said. I thought you would. Can you leave tomorrow morning? I can leave this afternoon if you need. He looked at her. Tomorrow morning, he said. I want to bring documentation from the Henderson sale if I can get it. I know old Henderson, he'll talk to me. That's good thinking, she said. He started to turn, then stopped. Evelyn, she looked at him. I want to say something, he said. And the quality of his voice had changed, not the property discussion voice, not the managerial voice, something underneath those. All right, she said. When I wrote to the matrimonial agency, he said, I told them I needed a practical woman. I wrote a list of practical requirements. I've been thinking about that letter for the past 4 days. And it was the most inadequate thing I've ever written, he said. And I write fence contracts, so that's saying something. She kept her face still, but something behind her sternum did a thing she hadn't expected. You came here, he said, and in 4 days you did more this ranch than I've managed in 5 years of running it alone. Not because you cooked better than the other people I brought in. Because you saw what was happening and you knew what to do about it, and you did it without waiting to be asked or given permission. He paused. I've been alone a long time, Evelyn. I forgot what it felt like to have someone in my corner who wasn't afraid of the fight. She held his gaze. I've been fighting my whole life, she said. I'm very practiced at it, I know that now. He held her eyes for another moment. I just wanted you to know that I see it, that I see you. He cleared his throat. That's all I wanted to say. The yard between them was very quiet. Thank you, she said, and she meant it in all the registers that phrase could carry when said by a woman who had spent most of her life being overlooked to a man who was telling her plainly that he did not intend to overlook her anymore. He nodded, turned and went back toward the barn. She stood in the yard with Foss's letter in her hand and the late morning light on her face, and she breathed carefully once. Then she went to tell Thomas they'd be leaving in the morning and to ask Jack whether the provisioning situation was holding. It was holding. Jack told her this with the brisk, slightly defensive efficiency of a man who had been surprised by his own competence and was not prepared to discuss it. He had adapted 2 of her substitutions, and the men had not complained, or rather, Pete had complained once about the porridge, and Walt had told him, in terms Jack described as thorough, exactly where he could put his complaint. She thanked Jack for the supper the other night, the kitchen table, the 2 kept warm plates. He looked at the wall beside her head. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Of course, she said. Neither do I. The second trip to the county seat was different from the first. Caleb had ridden over to the Henderson property the evening before and come back with old Carl Henderson in the wagon beside him, a man in his late 60s, angular and white-haired. With the compressed grief of someone who had sold something he loved, under conditions he hadn't fully understood. Henderson had the parcel sale documents with him, including the original complaint Sutter had filed, which was, as Foss confirmed when they arrived the next afternoon, nearly word for word identical to the complaint filed against Whitmore Ranch. The same language, the same structure, the same specific financial mechanism. Foss, reading the 2 complaints side by side, said, "This is the same document with different names." He didn't even bother to change the phrasing. Henderson, who had driven 2 hours to sit in a lawyer's office and look at the document that had cost him a piece of his family's land, said in a very quiet voice, I wish I'd known. I wish I had known there was someone to fight it. Evelyn, sitting beside him, said, You know now. And your document makes our case substantially stronger. It means Crane and Sutter can't claim independent action. This is a pattern, and patterns are how courts understand intent. Henderson looked at her. He had not known who she was when Caleb brought him, and she had watched him, during the wagon ride, quietly recalibrate, not with hostility, but with the cautious uncertainty of an older man encountering something his categories didn't quite accommodate. A large woman in a plain dress, sitting in a lawyer's office, talking about legal strategy with the confidence of someone who lived in that territory. "You understand all this?" he asked, not unkindly, just honestly. "I do," she said, equally honestly. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Caleb's lucky to have you." It was the second time in a week that a man had said something close to that, and the second time she had let it settle without deflecting it. "I'm fairly lucky too," she said. Foss filed the amended complaint that afternoon, now incorporating the Henderson documents, the pattern evidence, and a formal request for the circuit court to examine the coordinated nature of Sutter's filings. He also sent a letter to the Territorial Bank directly, to Prescott, noting that the basis for the credit hold had been filed as part of a documented pattern of misrepresentation, and that the bank's continued maintenance of the hold, in light of this information, might constitute participation in a civil harm. "That'll make Prescott very uncomfortable," Foss said, with a small professional satisfaction. "That's the intention," Evelyn said. On the road home, Henderson rode with them for the first stretch before his road diverged west, and when he climbed down from the wagon at the fork, he shook Caleb's hand and then turned to Evelyn and tipped his hat. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. She thanked him and watched him drive away, and then she and Caleb continued on in the direction of Whitmore Ranch, and the afternoon shifted into early evening around them, and Caleb said, after a while, "He tipped his hat to you." He did. Carl Henderson hasn't tipped his hat to a woman since his wife passed. That was 7 years ago. I know because he told me once. She looked at the road ahead of them. "People surprise you," she said, "when you give them the chance." He made that almost law sound again, the one she'd heard the first time on the road back from the first county seat trip, and she found she had already assigned it a particular value in the taxonomy of sounds that Caleb Whitmore made. They were 2 miles from the ranch when the other wagon appeared on the road ahead of them. It was coming toward them, and it was moving fast for a road this width. And as it got closer, Evelyn could see that the driver was one of the Holloway hands. She recognized the particular cut of the jacket from the night at supper, and beside him sat a man she hadn't seen before. Well dressed for a ranch road, coat that belonged in an office. Gerald Crane. She knew it before Caleb said it, from the way Caleb's whole body changed, the subtle hardening, the gathering of something, the way a man squares his shoulders when the thing he's been expecting arrives ahead of schedule. "That's Crane," Caleb said. "I know," she said. Crane's wagon slowed as it approached them, and Crane raised a hand in the civil gesture of a man who operates at the level of pleasantries regardless of what is actually happening. He was perhaps 55, well-maintained, with the smooth assurance of someone who had not been surprised in a long time. He looked at Caleb with the specific warmth of a man who believes he has already won. Then he looked at Evelyn. She watched him take her in the size of her, the plain dress, the fact of her sitting in the wagon beside Caleb coming from the direction of the county seat, and she watched him file her away in the same instant, the same fraction of a second, in the category where men like Gerald Crane filed women like Evelyn Hartwell. Not a factor. She let him file her there. She kept her face neutral and her hands still, and she met his eyes with the mild, attentive expression of a woman who is listening and thinking nothing in particular. "Whitmore, Crane from town?" "County seat," Caleb said. Something moved across Crane's face, small, controlled. He recovered it immediately. "Long drive for a weekday." "Hope it was worth the time." "It was," Caleb said. "Stopping by to see if you'd reconsidered the North Quarter," Crane said. Easy and conversational, the way a man makes a threat sound like a courtesy. "Holloway's prepared to make a generous offer." "The North Quarter's not for sale," Caleb said. "Things change," Crane said. "Circumstances change." A man's situation can shift faster than he expects. Not mine, Caleb said. Crane's eyes moved to Evelyn again briefly, and she saw in them the particular assessment of a man who is deciding whether a thing is worth addressing. He decided it wasn't. He smiled pleasantly. Well, you know where to find us when you change your mind. He clicked his horses forward, and the wagon moved past them, and Evelyn did not watch it go. She watched Caleb. Caleb watched the wagon pass, and then he looked straight ahead, and his hands on the reins were very steady. And she could see in his profile the same thing she had seen when he'd read Foss's letter, the controlled processing of anger into something that could be used. He doesn't know yet, she said quietly. About Foss's filing. About Henderson. He went to the ranch to find you there, and instead he found Jack. Jack would have told him nothing. She paused. He looked at me twice, I noticed. He put me in a category. Caleb turned and looked at her. I know what category. It's going to cost him, she said. Caleb held her gaze for a long moment. And in the specificity of what passed between them in that moment was something that would have been very difficult to put into language, the shared understanding of two people who have been fighting the same fight from the same position, who know exactly what the other has staked, and who have arrived, without discussing it, at the same certainty about how it ends. Yes, he said. It is, he faced forward. She faced forward. And the ranch came into view ahead of them, the lights in the windows already burning against the darkening evening, and from the kitchen window she could see the movement of someone. Thomas, she thought. From the shape of the shadow, and the whole of what she had built in 8 days in that broken kitchen and that empty household was there, present, lit from the inside. Hers. She did not let herself say it out loud, not yet, but she thought it with the full, clear weight of a woman who has earned the right to claim a thing. Theirs. The wagon rolled into the yard and Thomas came out of the barn before they had fully stopped, and his face when he saw them, the relief in it, the genuine gladness hit her somewhere unexpected. Jack got a telegram, Thomas said, this afternoon. From Foss. What did it say? Caleb asked. Thomas looked between them. The emergency review came through early. The credit hold has been lifted. Prescott sent word to Aldridge this afternoon. He paused. And there's something else. Foss says the circuit court clerk wants to talk to both of you. There's a judge who wants to hear the full case in 3 weeks. He looked at Evelyn directly. He said to make sure Mrs. Whitmore is in that courtroom. In the yard, in the evening quiet, with the horses blowing gently and the kitchen light in the window, and Thomas's face open and certain and waiting, Evelyn Hartwell let that sentence land where it landed. He said to make sure Mrs. Whitmore is in that courtroom. She was going to be in that courtroom, not as a woman who had come to manage a household, not as an arrangement that had served a practical purpose, as the person who had understood what was happening when nobody else had, who had built the documentation that made the case possible, who had sat in a lawyer's office and driven to a county seat and read a banker's body language, and listened at a supper table, and turned all of it into something that was going to stand up in front of a judge. As herself, she said, in a voice she kept even because that was who she was, and she was not going to change that now just because something mattered. Tell Jack to make sure there's supper waiting. We'll be in 10 minutes. Thomas nodded and went. Caleb climbed down from the wagon and came around to her side and held up his hand. She looked at his hand. She took it. He helped her down, and then he did not let go immediately, and she did not pull away. And they stood in the yard in the early dark for a moment that neither of them named but both of them understood was a being crossed not from one thing to another, but from something uncertain into something that was no longer uncertain at all. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she agreed. We'll be ready. We already are, she said. And she walked toward the kitchen door, toward the warmth and the light and the sound of Jack's boots on the floor within, toward the life she had begun, without ceremony and without apology, to build. The 3 weeks before the hearing moved the way time moves when everything is at stake, fast in the days, slow in the nights, with a quality of alertness to each hour that made ordinary things feel weighted with significance. Evelyn cooked. She planned. She met with Foss twice more, once in the county seat and once when he rode out to the ranch to review the final documentation. And she sat across from him at the kitchen table, with her chronology spread between them, and walked him through every piece of it in the sequence she'd built, answering his questions with the precision of someone who had lived inside this material for 3 weeks and knew every corner of it. Foss, on his second visit, sat back at the end of their session and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead." When the judge asks questions, and he will, the circuit judge in this district asks questions. He doesn't sit quiet. Are you prepared to answer them? In the courtroom, on the record. She looked at him steadily. Is that an unusual thing to ask? For most wives who've helped with case preparation, yes. Then I'm an unusual wife, she said, and yes, I'm prepared. Foss nodded once, with the small satisfied expression of a man who had hoped for that answer. Good, he said, because the pattern evidence is strongest when it's explained by the person who found it, and you found it. Caleb, who had been sitting at the end of the table throughout this exchange, said nothing. But when Foss rode out an hour later and the yard was quiet again, he came into the kitchen, where Evelyn was putting the papers back in order, and he said, without preamble, I want to talk about the name. She kept organizing the papers. Which name? The one you used at the bank, he said. Evelyn Whitmore. She set the papers down and turned to look at him. He was standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and he had the specific look of a man who had been working up to something for longer than he wanted to admit, and had decided that working up to it was taking more energy than just saying it. We signed papers through the agency, he said. We have a legal arrangement. But we haven't, he stopped. Try it again. I'd like to do it properly. Before the hearing, if you're willing. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you asking me to marry you, Caleb? He met her eyes. Yes, he said, I am. The kitchen was very quiet. You're not asking because of the hearing, she said. It was not a question. No, he said, I'm asking because of the past 3 weeks. Because of the wagon road and the bank and the supper table and Foss's office and the night you sat in this kitchen until midnight building a case for a ranch that wasn't yours yet. He paused. Because of a lot of things I didn't expect and should have. She thought about the night she'd arrived. The laughter at the gate, the broken kitchen and the near-empty shelves and the narrow bed at the end of the hall where she'd lain in the dark and told herself she could build something here. She thought about every incremental moment between then and this one, Jack and the hooks, Thomas and the stool, Walt with his eyes closed over the soup, the word bank, the wagon road to the county seat, Caleb's hand holding hers in the dark of the yard. She thought about Clara, who had run this kitchen before her, and about the grief that had emptied it, and about what it meant that a man who had closed himself against that grief for 5 years was standing in front of her with his hat in his hands, asking her to stay. Yes, she said, I'm willing. He exhaled a slow, controlled breath, but she heard what was in it. Before the hearing, he said. Before the hearing, she agreed. They married 4 days before the courthouse date, in the front room of the ranch house, with Thomas Reed and Jack Dawson as witnesses, and the circus preacher who passed through every 6 weeks, making the occasion official and brief. Hector stood in the doorway because he said he was just passing through, which nobody believed but everyone allowed. Pete stood beside Hector, with his hat held in both hands, and the expression of a young man encountering something that was restructuring his understanding of several things at once. The preacher asked the questions. They answered them. Caleb put a ring on her finger, plain silver, his mother's, which he had retrieved from the small box in his desk drawer the morning of the ceremony and presented to her without ceremony, just held it out in his palm and let her take it. She put it on herself. When the preacher said they were married, Thomas said yes under his breath, like the answer to a question he'd been carrying. Jack shook Caleb's hand. Then he turned to Evelyn, and he extended his hand to her too, and when she shook it, he held it for just a moment longer than a handshake required, and he said, very quietly, Welcome home, Mrs. Whitmore. She was not going to cry in the front room of the ranch house in front of Jack Dawson. She was absolutely not going to do that. Thank you, Jack. she said, in a voice that was perfectly even. He let go of her hand and walked out to the yard, and she was fairly certain, from the particular angle of his shoulders, that he was doing the same work she was. The night before the hearing, Evelyn could not sleep. She lay in the room that was now fully hers, their room, the room where Caleb's boots stood beside hers near the door, and his jacket hung on the hook next to her coat, and she stared at the ceiling and ran through everything she knew in the sequence she had built. The way she always did before something significant, making sure nothing was missing, making sure every piece was where it needed to be. She knew the chronology by heart. She knew Foss's filing by heart. She knew the Henderson comparison documents by heart. She knew what she had heard at the supper table, and how it aligned with the timeline, and why that alignment mattered. She knew the mechanism Crane and Sutter had used, and she knew why that mechanism had failed the way they hadn't anticipated, because they had not anticipated her. That was the thing, the center of it, the piece she kept returning to. Gerald Crane had designed a scheme that worked on a specific assumption, that the person running the Whitmore household would be, at most, a woman who managed food and domestics and left the financial and legal territory to the man she worked for. That she would hear the word bank at the supper table and not understand what it meant. That she would see a credit hold arrive and accept it as a fact of circumstances rather than an action to be countered. That she would be, in the most complete sense of the word, not a factor. He had not been wrong to make that assumption based on what he knew. He had been catastrophically wrong about Evelyn Hartwell. She lay in the dark and she felt the ring on her finger, and she listened to Caleb breathing beside her slow, even, either asleep or doing a convincing imitation of it, and she let herself, privately, in the quiet of the room, be certain. Not arrogant, not boastful, certain. The courthouse in the county seat was larger than she expected, and more crowded. Foss had told them that the circuit judge, a man named Aldous Merchant, drew attention when he held open hearings, because he had a reputation for not being managed by the established interests in the territory, which made him either deeply respected or deeply inconvenient, depending on who you were. Today's gallery was full ranchers, townspeople, a scattering of men she didn't recognize who had the look of people who had traveled specifically to be present. Carl Henderson was there in the third row, with his hat on his knee. He nodded when he saw Evelyn come in, a small deliberate nod that meant more than it looked like. The Holloway contingent was on the other side of the gallery, Crane, and two men she recognized from the supper table, and beside them Sutter, the lawyer, who was a compact, careful-looking man in his 40s, with the particular stillness of someone running calculations. Sutter looked at Evelyn when she came in. She sat down, arranged Foss's documents in her lap in the order she needed them, and did not look back at Sutter. Foss leaned over and said quietly, "Merchant opens cold." "No pleasantries." "I'm ready," she said. Judge Merchant was a man of perhaps 60, with close-cut white hair and the kind of face that had been imposing for so long it had stopped requiring effort. He opened the session the way Foss had promised, without pleasantries, without ceremony, with the brisk directness of someone who had too much to do and intended to do all of it. He read the filing. He asked Foss 3 specific questions. Then he looked across at Sutter and said, "Counselor Sutter, respond to the pattern allegation." Specifically, Sutter rose. He was smooth, she gave him that. He had the fluent confidence of a man who had stood in many rooms and been the most prepared person in them. He argued that the two filings were similar in form, because legal complaints in property matters use standard language. That similarity of structure did not imply coordination. That the Whitmore complaint was a legitimate response to a genuine boundary uncertainty. Merchant listened without expression. Then he said, "Who filed the boundary uncertainty claim?" "My client's foreman, Gerald Crane, identified the potential discrepancy and—" "The original filing is in your name, Counselor." A very small pause. "As the legal representative of my client's interests, I filed on his behalf based on—" "Did you conduct an independent survey before filing?" Sutter's smoothness developed a hairline fracture. A survey wasn't required at the preliminary complaint stage. You filed a complaint asserting a boundary discrepancy as grounds for a financial instrument hold, merchant said, with the specific patience of a man who is not actually being patient, without conducting a survey to establish whether the discrepancy existed. The standard for a preliminary complaint, I know the standard, merchant said. I've been setting standards in this district for 14 years. He looked down at the documents on his bench. I'm going to ask you to sit down, counselor, while I hear from the other side. Sutter sat. Foss presented cleanly and quickly the timeline, the documents, the Henderson comparison, the bank hold mechanism, the sequence of events. He had a gift for linear argument, Evelyn thought. Watching him, he built the case the way she built a supply plan, piece by piece in logical order, each element supporting the next. Then Merchant looked up and said, "Who compiled this chronology?" Foss said, "My client, Mrs. Whitmore." Merchant looked at her directly. "Mrs. Whitmore, come forward." She stood, gathered her documents, and walked to the front of the courtroom. She was aware of the gallery behind her, the weight of the room, the attention in it, and she was aware of Crane's eyes on her back, and she was aware of Caleb, who had risen slightly from his seat when she stood, an instinct he probably didn't know he had. She stood in front of Merchant's bench, and she looked at him steadily, and he looked back at her with the flat, assessorial attention of a man who had seen a great many things and was reserving judgment on this one. "Tell me how you identified the credit hold as connected to the supper visit," he said. "In your own words, not legal language," she told him. She told him about the Holloway men at the table, the conversation she'd overheard, the specific words bank and pressure and past autumn. She told him about going to Aldridge's store the next morning and finding the hold, and about reading the date on the notice and understanding the timeline. She told him about Prescott at the bank, the papers held at the wrong angle, the door on his left that he'd tried not to look at. She told him plainly and in order, without embellishment, without legal framing, the way she would tell someone at her kitchen table. The courtroom was completely quiet. Merchant listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What did you do with that information the night you gathered it?" "I went to Mr. Whitmore's office and told him everything I'd heard. I recommended we go to the bank the next morning, and that night I started writing the chronology." Why the chronology? Because in my experience, the difference between a complaint and a case is documentation. A complaint is someone saying a thing happened. A case is a record of why you know a thing happened, in the sequence it happened, with the evidence attached to each step. She paused. "If this ever came before a judge, I wanted every step to be visible." Merchant looked at her for a long moment. "Were you trained in law?" he said. "No," she said. "I managed the household and files for a property lawyer in Wichita for 4 years. I listened while he worked. Apparently you listened well." "He was good at what he did," she said. "It wasn't difficult to learn from him." Something moved across Merchant's face, not a smile, but the controlled vicinity of one. "Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Thank you." She walked back to her seat. She did not look at the Holloway side of the gallery. She sat down and put her documents in order and kept her face neutral. Caleb's hand, without ceremony, came across and rested over hers on the documents. She did not move. Merchant spent the next 40 minutes working through the case with the systematic attention she had hoped for, asking Foss sharp questions, asking Sutter sharper ones, reviewing the Henderson documents with a specific attention to the identical phrasing that Foss had flagged. He called Henderson to speak briefly, and Henderson was plain and direct and said what he knew without dressing it, and Merchant listened to him with the same weight he'd given everything else. Then he sat back. The courtroom was very quiet. "Sutter," Merchant said, "I'm going to say something on the record that I don't say lightly. The filings in this matter, reviewed against the Henderson precedent and the documented timeline provided by Mrs. Whitmore, constitute, in my assessment, a pattern of misrepresentation to a financial institution for the purpose of engineering property distress. That is not a boundary dispute. That is not a standard commercial negotiation. That is fraud. Sutter had gone very still. I am referring this matter to the Territorial Attorney for Criminal Review, Merchant continued. I am issuing an immediate order vacating the credit hold and expunging the complaint from Whitmore Ranch's financial record. I am also issuing a notice to the Territorial Bank regarding Prescott's office's role in maintaining a hold after the basis, for that hold was being actively disputed. They will want to cooperate with the review. He looked at the gallery with the specific authority of a man who had said difficult things in public many times. Gerald Crane, you are named in this referral. I would strongly advise you to speak with your own counsel before this week is out. From the gallery, where Gerald Crane had been sitting with the composed assurance of a man who believed the room would resolve in his favor, there came a silence that was a different quality than the silence that had preceded it. Evelyn heard it. She did not turn around to see his face. She was looking at Merchant's bench, and then at Foss, who was making a note with the controlled efficiency of a professional who does not celebrate early, and then at Carl Henderson in the third row, who had his hands folded on top of his hat and his head slightly bowed, not in defeat but in the posture of a man absorbing something he has waited a long time to hear. She thought about his East Quarter. She thought about how you sold something that had been your family's, because you didn't know you could fight and win. She thought about Durant in Kansas and the 20 farming families who had not known until it was almost too late, and the way the outcome had changed completely when someone understood the shape of the scheme they were inside. Merchant closed the session. The gallery began to move. Caleb stood, and she stood beside him. Foss was shaking Caleb's hand and saying something about the referral and the timeline, and around them the room was doing the complicated thing rooms do after something significant has been decided. People reorganizing themselves around the new reality. Sutter left quickly without speaking to anyone. The two Holloway hands followed him. Crane did not leave quickly. She felt him before she saw him, the approach of someone moving with the specific quality of controlled anger that has been dressed in civility for long enough to be unstable. She turned. Crane was 3 feet away. He was looking at Caleb, but the look included her, and it was the first time she had been fully included in one of his looks, not as background, not as a category he'd dismissed, but as someone he had identified too late, as the thing that had undone him. Whitmore, he said. Caleb looked at him. Your wife, Crane said, and the word came out with the particular weight of a man who had not expected to have to say it with respect, and was furious at being required to, is not what I expected. Caleb held his gaze. She isn't. Crane looked at Evelyn then. Directly, without the category he'd filed her in, because that category had proved itself useless. She met his eyes. She kept her face exactly what it was, not triumphant, not cold, not forgiving. Simply present. Simply the woman who had sat at his adversary's supper table and listened and understood and built the thing that had just been read into the record of a territorial court. Crane said nothing more. He turned and walked out. The ride home was different from any of the rides before it. Henderson had clasped her hand at the courthouse door and said, in a voice that was thick with more than he could say cleanly, my daughter's land. Maybe there's a way to get it looked at again, with all this on the record. Talk to Foss, she said. What's been exposed changes the legal landscape. There may be remedies. His eyes were bright in the particular way of old men who have kept hope smaller than it wanted to be for a long time and then find it expanding again against their expectation. He nodded and let her hand go and walked toward his own wagon, and she watched him for a moment before she turned to find Caleb. He was waiting at their wagon. He watched her cross the courthouse yard toward him. And as she got closer, she could see on his face the particular expression she had come to understand was how he looked when something was larger than his usual containment could fully manage the eyes more open than usual, the jaw slightly soft rather than set. He held out his hand. She took it. He helped her up, and then he climbed up beside her, and they sat for just a moment before he picked up the reins, the courthouse yard still active around them, and he said, Evelyn. Yes, I want to say something, and I want to say it right. All right. He was quiet for a moment. And she understood he was doing what he always did, working out the true shape of the thing, before he committed to saying it, because for Caleb Whitmore, words were not casual instruments. "You came to this ranch as a stranger," he said. "You came because you had nowhere else and I had a need, and we were both practical enough to make an arrangement out of that." He paused. "And what you have done in 8 days, and then 3 weeks, and today in that courtroom, is not something I can account for with the word arrangement." He turned and looked at her. "What you have done is build something here, in this ranch, in this household, in me. And I am not a man who says things like that. But I am also not a man who fails to say something true when he knows it's true, and the person it's true about is sitting right next to him." The yard was moving around them, and she did not see any of it. She looked at Caleb Whitmore, who had written a list of practical requirements and gotten something he didn't have language for, and who was sitting beside her in the county seat, courthouse yard, telling her so in the plainest, most undecorated, most genuine way available to a man who had spent 5 years protecting himself from sincerity. "I love you," he said, and it landed between them like the first stone into still water, and the rings from it went outward in every direction. She thought about the wagon arriving at the ranch, the laughter, the broken kitchen, the night she'd lain on the narrow bed and told herself she could build something here. She had not known that night what she was building. She knew now. "I love you too," she said. And she meant it in every register, those words carried for a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had arrived, at 38, in the most unlikely place, to find that someone saw her completely and was not afraid of what they saw. He picked up the reins. They drove home. Thomas met them in the yard before the wagon had fully stopped. He had clearly been watching for them, and the look on his face when he read theirs told him what he needed to know before either of them spoke. He let out a breath and then recovered himself and said, in his best approximation of professional calm, "Jack's got supper on." "Jack cooked," Evelyn said. "He said you'd be tired when you got back." Thomas paused. "He also said if you told anyone he said that, he'd deny it." "Sounds like Jack," Caleb said. Inside, the kitchen smelled of the bean and ham recipe she'd left written out for Jack, on the 3rd week of the provisioning plan, the one she'd marked as his best option for a full-table supper when supplies were at the rationing level. He had made it correctly. She could tell from the doorway that he had made it correctly, and the knowledge of that Jack Dawson, in her kitchen, making her recipe for the men she fed, keeping things running while she was gone, hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. Jack was at the stove when she came in, and he turned, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the question on his face was answered by her face before she said a word. He turned back to the stove. "Wash up," he said gruffly. "It's ready." The men came in for supper, and the table was loud that night. Thomas had told someone, or his face had, and word had moved around the ranch the way word always moved among men who lived in close proximity, which was faster than conversation and more complete than announcement. By the time they sat down, everyone knew. Pete was vibrating with something he was trying to manage into adulthood. Walt had the settled expression of a man whose assessment had been confirmed. Hector, at his end of the table, caught Evelyn's eye when she set the bread down and gave her the small, precise nod that she had come to understand was his version of a standing ovation. She sat at the table with the men not serving from the edges as she had in the first days, but at the table, in the place that was hers, and Caleb sat at the head, and the meal moved around them with the warmth of something earned. Pete, midway through supper, said to no one in particular, "Is Crane really going to be charged?" "That's for the territorial attorney to decide," Caleb said. "But it looked bad for him?" "It looked accurate," Evelyn said. "Which for Crane is worse than bad." A short silence. Then Thomas made a sound that was entirely a laugh and entirely suppressed. And then Walt didn't suppress it, and the table broke open, and even Jack, at the far end, pressed his lips together in the way she'd learned to translate. After supper, after the men had gone and Thomas had, for the 3rd time now, cleared plates without being asked and carried them to the basin and gone to bed, and Jack had followed with the particular dignity of a man who will not be thanked, Evelyn and Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table in the quiet of the ranch night. She had her hands around a cup of coffee. He had his hat off. The lamp between them was the same lamp that had been there the first night, when she'd sat alone in this kitchen after supper and listened to a house that hadn't yet decided what she was to it. She thought about that night now, and about the distance between that night and this one, and about how distance worked in lives, how sometimes you crossed enormous territory in a very short time. And the steps felt ordinary while you were taking them, and it was only when you stopped and looked back that you understood how far you'd come. "I've been thinking about what comes next," she said. "Tell me, Henderson's land. If Foss can build a case for recovery of property sold under fraudulent pressure, there may be other ranches in the same position. If Crane and Sutter did this 3 times that we know of, they likely did it more." She cupped her coffee. "Someone needs to document it. Talk to the families. Build the same kind of record I built for us." He looked at her. "You're proposing to do that. I'm proposing we help do that. With Foss, with Henderson, who has standing now and knows the others better than we do." She met his eyes. "What was done to us was done to other people who didn't have someone at their supper table who knew what they were hearing. I can't do anything about the past, but I can help with what comes next." He held her gaze. "You know what you are," he said quietly. "I have a general sense," she said. "You're the most capable person I've ever had a conversation with," he said. "Including every man I've done business with in 20 years of running this ranch." She did not deflect it. It sit in the air between them, and she said thank you. He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat together in the kitchen that had been broken when she arrived, and was not broken anymore, in the house that had been emptied by grief and was not empty anymore, on the ranch that had been running on survival and was beginning now to run on something more. Outside, Montana was doing what Montana did in the late evening, the particular quality of the dark there, the specific size of the sky, the sound of the land settling into night. She did not need to look at it to know it. She had learned it in the weeks she'd been here, the way you learn a place when you're paying full attention, which she always was. She thought about the women who would come after the ones on other ranches, in other broken kitchens, in other arrangements that had been made out of practicality and necessity. The ones who would arrive carrying everything they owned in a single bag, stepping down off wagons into laughter, lifting their chins, because there was nothing else to do. She thought about what she would say to them if she could, what she knew now that she had not known when she arrived. She would say, "The kitchen is not where they put you to keep you from mattering. The kitchen is where everything that matters begins." She would say, "The people who underestimate you are not your obstacle. They are your advantage." She would say, "Build it anyway. Build it with broken tools and near-empty shelves and a stove that doesn't fully work. Build it in the dark before anyone else is awake. Build it quietly and carefully and without waiting for permission. And one day, not immediately, not easily, but certainly the people who laughed at you when you arrived will be the ones standing in the yard telling newcomers who you are." She would say, "I know, because that happened to me." She would say, "I am Evelyn Whitmore, and I built something here that nobody expected, on a ranch that needed exactly what I had to give, in a life I chose and earned and made entirely my own." She looked at Caleb across the kitchen table, her hand in his, the lamp between them, the ranch quiet around them. She did not say any of those things aloud. She didn't need to. She was already living them, fully, without apology, in the only place that had ever felt completely like home. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.